In this video, I'll be reviewing the stories in an anthology from Solaris Books. This one is called The Solaris Book of New Science Fiction, Volume 2. Solaris Books was started in 2007 and published several anthologies in the first few years of its existence. This is the second book of a 3-book anthology series, though any of the books and stories could be read with no prior knowledge of any other book or short story that they've published. The first story in this one is by Paul DeFilippo and is called iCity. The story follows an architect that is competing in competitions to design the next friendly neighborhood. The catch is that each neighborhood is rated by its inhabitants, and many neighborhoods only last a matter of weeks, if not days. When the current architect of a neighborhood has their design voted down enough in popularity, the new competition to design that neighborhood takes place. It sounds crazy that someone would constantly redesign, tear down, and rebuild neighborhoods like this. However, the central science fiction idea in this story that makes it work is that there is a substance that makes up the neighborhoods. That substance is very malleable, almost like putty, and it is intelligent, so it can form and reform as needed when new designs are created. I'd rate this story a 5 out of 10. The story itself is kind of so-so. The rivalry between the main character and his arch rival was remotely entertaining, though not enough to make the story great. The next story is called Space Crawl Blues, and it was written by Kay Kenyon. The main character is a spaceship captain named Blake Neva. His problem is that new teleportation technology has made space travel obsolete, and he's on his way to say goodbye to a ship that he cares about. This story kind of has a sad tone to it. You can tell that Blake cares about the ship as if it's one of his kids, and he doesn't want it to die. He thinks about the way it'll be torn down for parts, and it makes him sad, hence the story's name, Space Crawl Blues. I liked this story more than the previous story, and I'm rating it a 6 out of 10. There's a revelation that's a little confusing at first, but it becomes clear by the end of this tale, and it changes things. The captain's love for his ship isn't overstated, but it's shown well in his attitudes and actions throughout the story. The third story in the book is called The Line of Dichotomy, and it's part of author Chris Roberson's Celestial Empire universe. A bannerman is a soldier in the Celestial Empire. It's possible that this relates to a banner carrier for a military unit, but I doubt it in this case. Because it's the Celestial Empire, I think it's more likely that it's a reference to the word Hatamoto, which was a high-ranking samurai in feudal Japan. Hatamoto apparently roughly translates as bannerman. I could be completely wrong on that, though. Yao Guanzhong is one such bannerman, and he's leading a small team of men. Their mission is to rescue some scientists at a bacteria farm who have been attacked by soldiers of the Mexic Empire. Unfortunately, their first plan doesn't go well, and they have to go on the run with the scientists in tow. Aside from seeing the leaders in action, there isn't a lot of deep characterization going on here. About the only time that happens is when Bannerman Yao and the science team leader, a woman named Tien, talk about how long they've been on the planet Firestar and what brought them there in the first place. There's a discussion about how the conflict between the two empires started, and there's a theme that comes through from that conversation. It's basically that soldiers on both sides of a conflict often believe their side's propaganda. The final scene indicates that that propaganda doesn't matter to Yao, only the loyalty to his side that he feels. This is military science fiction with some action and some slower parts to catch a breath. It's a decent story, but I didn't think it was amazing by any stretch. I'm rating it a 6 out of 10. I do have a book called 3 Unbroken, which appears to be a standalone novel in this setting, so I may have to read that one soon, just to see if it's any good, and because it's a standalone, which is always a good thing. The next story is called 50 Dinosaurs and was written by one of my favorite science fiction authors, one of my favorite short fiction authors, Robert Reed. This one starts off with a guy following what he thinks is an apatosaur through the jungle. He gets interrupted by a T-Rex that's about twice his size and his name's Sandra. Aside from the T-Rex named Sandra, there's also something odd about the setting because the time doesn't seem to flow normally in the space they're in. This wasn't a story about a time traveler getting stuck in time with dinosaurs. And it's a story where pretty much next to nothing happens. And that includes my understanding of where Robert Reed was trying to go with it all. There were a few lines of dialogue that I thought were nice, but they were mainly reinforcing ideas like humans being the biggest killers in the history of the Earth. I really didn't like the story at all and rated a 2 out of 10, which just goes to show that even stories by your favorites won't always hit you just right. Next up is Mason's Rat, Black Rat by Neil Asher. This story is a sequel to Mason's Rats, which can be found in the April-May 2005 issue of Asimov's magazine or in David Hotwell's Best SF Volume 11. In that story, a farmer tries to exterminate the rats infesting his barn with a surprising outcome. This story appears to be a sequel where a new black rat has decided to take up residence. I'd rate it a 5 out of 10. It's a quick read and it's silly and whimsical, so, take it for what it's worth. I skipped ahead to the second Neil Asher story in the book, which is called Mason's Rat's Autotractor. In this one, Mason has to deal with a rogue Autotractor that isn't handling its programming properly. That kind of gets resolved pretty quickly, but then Mason has to deal with a new problem when a bureaucrat shows up with a big stack of paperwork that Mason has to fill out. This story pretty much appears to be Neil Asher saying the government sucks and puts too many restrictions or requirements on the little man. I don't completely disagree with that sentiment. Overall, I'd rate this story a 5 out of 10, just like the previous Mason's Rats story. It's pretty simple with a fairly obvious conclusion that's foreshadowed in the brief story's beginning. The next story is called Blood Bonds by Brenda Cooper. She's written a few novels and some short stories. Probably best known are Building Harlequin's Moon with Larry Niven and a novel called Edge of Dark. This story is basically about a woman named Lissa, whose sister, Aline, is a paraplegic. Lissa believes it's her fault that her sister was at an event where a terrorist bomb disabled her. Since then, she's been working on Mars, saving everything she earns so that she can buy Aline a new body. So that's the premise of the story. But once it gets all that established, it kind of goes off in a different direction with some sort of AI rebellion happening. At one point, it turns into an AI-assisted flashback and a bunch of navel gazing. I'm rating this one a 4 out of 10. There was a little bit of character development and a little bit of plot, but it didn't feel like it had much of an ending, so I didn't really like it all that much. Peter Watts is a Canadian science fiction author who's best known for the novel Blindsight. His entry in this book is called The Eyes of God. The entire story is a single scene. A man is waiting to board a plane and he's concerned. There's a technology that detects people's criminal thoughts, and the tech can then take steps to prevent criminal actions. It's almost like the precogs in the Minority Report movie starring Tom Cruise. The narrator has never done anything wrong, but he's worried about his thoughts. It's a very short and interesting story, and I'd rate it a 5 out of 10. As I was reading this, I began to wonder if the story was generated by Watts's run-in with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol at the U.S.-Canadian border, where he was detained in December 2009. However, this anthology was published in 2008, so there seems to be no connection there. British science fiction author Eric Brown wrote the next story, which is called Sunworld. The main character, Yerrick Marwell, just finished college and goes home to his parents' farm on the plains. Because he's their second son and tradition says he won't inherit the farm, he has to find something else to do. He's worried about telling his parents that he wants to be an architect. When he does tell them that, they crush his hopes and tell him what he's gonna do. And then later that night, an even bigger revelation about his parentage is dropped on him. Yerrick faces a bunch of big changes in this story. The academic life he had is over. His dreams of doing what he wanted are crushed. The family revelation has given him a new purpose as he leaves his girlfriend behind and gets shipped off to someplace new that he's never been before. There's a lot going on in Yerrick's point of view, but there isn't any real challenge to anything that's going on. Yerrick does go through the entire story pretty much accepting whatever fate hands him without any real resistance. One thing about Sunworld is that it doesn't seem like it's a normal world. The sun never truly sets. It just gets dimmer and brighter. The descriptions lead the reader to believe that the world is flat. There is an interesting explanation for these things near the end of the story, but that was about the best part of the story. When I finished reading it, I felt like I'd just read the first couple chapters of a book and wondered where the rest of the story really was. Unfortunately, Eric Brown passed away in 2023. When I looked up his entries in ISFDB, it looked like this was just a standalone story. If you know of other stories that are tied to this one, please put that in the comments. I'd rate this one a 6 out of 10. If this story had been about 20 pages shorter, I'd rate it a little higher. Unfortunately, it's too long for the payoff at the end, which, as I already said, made me wonder if there was more to it. The next story is called Evil Robot Monkey by Mary Robinette Kowal. Sly is a primate, probably a chimpanzee, that just wants to be left alone and work with his clay. When some kids on a tour distract him, he reacts poorly, and one of the scientific attendants has to come and talk to him. I enjoyed this story, and I'm rating it a 7 out of 10. It's barely 4 pages long, but Kowal captures Sly's frame of mind well as he deals with his captivity, the annoying kids, and the possibility of losing the one thing that he really cares about. It's a good story, even though it's so short. Next up is a mech story by Dominic Green titled Shining Armor. The village where the story happens has a large mech that can only be operated by one specific person. When some bad corporate actors come in to terrorize the village, a boy who thinks his dad can run the mech and an old man that's always exercising with a sword have to deal with the situation. I thought this one was entertaining, and I'd rate it a 6 out of 10, even though it was predictable. The soldiers acted like your basic dumb thugs. The boy is amazed by the events around him. The reveal is pretty obvious long before it happens, and the mech does its job. Carl Schrader wrote the story titled Book, Theater, and Wheel for this anthology. This one has a successful merchant that lives in a secluded vale where her family has lived for centuries. She's suspected of teaching her agents to read because they're so good at their jobs. A priest and knight are sent to investigate the situation because it's technically illegal to teach other people to read in this world. The story occurs on Earth, and it felt closer to fantasy than science fiction to me. The priest is dead set on discovering the secret of the agent's ability and anything else that he can use to bring down the merchant. The knight is a more moderate voice who's willing to listen to the merchant woman, and most of it's told from his point of view. I'd rate this one a 7 out of 10, even though it didn't seem like science fiction. The priest seems like a bit of a stereotype until near the end of the story and his reasons are revealed. The merchant and the knight are given more depth than the priest, and they develop a friendship that seems believable. Besides the characters, there's a hidden amphitheater and an entire secret messaging system in the story that's kind of interesting. And the ending was also done pretty well too. So it's worth the read. Mathralon is the title of the next story, and it was written by David Lewis Edelman. This story lays out the environment and activities happening on a mining planet. The miners have to follow a very specific process to get even just a small bit of material called Mathralon. Once they have it, that substance is handed over to automated ships that take it to their customers. That description doesn't do the story justice, but I can't say too much more or the entire thing is given away. I'd rate this one a 7 out of 10. There are no specific characters in the story, but the writing has an intriguing quality to it that pulled me through the story just because I just wanted to know where it was all going. I thought the end of the story was set up and delivered well, too. The next to last story in the book is by well-known science fiction and fantasy author Michael Moorcock, and the title is Modem Times. This was such a frustrating read that I had to read it in short chunks of 5 to 10 pages at a time. Unfortunately, it's also the longest story in the book at 71 pages. It was never clear to me where this story was going. It seemed to be about a time traveler that might be an assassin or special agent of some kind. Each mini chapter started with a snippet from a magazine or newspaper that typically didn't seem to have much to do with what was about to happen in the story. Um, I got to rate this one a 1 out of 10. I couldn't find the story here amidst a ton of seemingly random scenes whose only connection was the characters in them. The title page for this story says it's a Jerry Cornelius story. Moorcock's ISFDB page says there are a lot of Jerry Cornelius stories, and I hope they aren't all like this because it was just a mess to me. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I need to read some of those others to get it. I don't know. Maybe I need to be British to get all the references too. I don't know. It would take a lot to get me to read another story starring Jerry Cornelius at this point, though. The final story in the book is Point of Contact by Dan Abnett. Aliens have arrived at Earth, but these are apparently the most run-of-the-mill aliens in the universe. This is another story with no dialogue or specific characters, kind of like the previous story, Mathralon, that I talked about. I like this story a lot, and I'd rate it an 8 out of 10. It isn't super inventive, but it pulls at most, if not all, of the alien invasion tropes that have been around science fiction for a long time, and it turns them all around. It doesn't take long to read it, and it was a great ending to the book. Overall, I'd rate this anthology a 5 out of 10. Of the 15 stories, only 4 were above average, and 7 were a 5 or below on my scale. If you've read these stories and have a different opinion or think I missed something, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this review, leave a like and subscribe to help out my channel. And thanks and bye for now.